Hello, and thank you for joining us today as we discuss the humanitarian and food insecurity crisis in the Horn of Africa. I'm Rob Glenn, the Vice President of Global Resilience at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I lead our programming before, during, and after disasters and crises, domestically and abroad. This meeting is closed to the press, so if you're a member of the media, please log off now. For any inquiries, you can reach out to our Foundation media team. Before I get started with the content of the call today, I just do want to highlight the fact that Afghanistan suffered a significant earthquake, loss of lives, over 1,000 people, and certainly our thoughts are with them, and we're also closely monitoring the situation as to how the business community may be able to help in the coming days, given the very challenging dynamics in that environment. Providing context for the discussion today, many countries are facing growing levels of food insecurity, reversing years of development gains and threatening the achievement of sustainable development goals over the next decade. This is according to a recent World Bank update on global food security, which highlights that even before COVID-19, reduced incomes and disrupted supply chains, chronic and acute hunger were on the rise due to various factors, including conflict, socioeconomic conditions, natural hazards, climate change, and other factors. Certainly the impact of the war in Ukraine adds risk to the global food security, with food prices likely to remain high for the foreseeable future and expected to push millions of additional people into acute food insecurity. Today, we're focused on the Horn of Africa in this context. The Horn of Africa is one of the world's most food insecure regions, with 8 countries, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, and South Sudan, and Uganda. They've got a combined population of over 160 million people, 70 million of whom live in areas prone to extreme food shortages historically. Food insecurity in the Horn of Africa is associated with the inability of people to have access to food due to persistent prevalence of poverty in the region. Unfortunately, this has been the case for some time, and recently the situation has become much more dire. Today, we will hear about the immense needs and communities facing the threat of starvation after 4 consecutive rainy seasons that have failed in parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. It's a climatic event that has not been seen for a generation, at least 40 years. We want to explore tangible ways for the private sector to engage in the process of addressing the issues posed by the situation. At the Chamber Foundation, we really do believe that businesses are a force for good. That's especially evident during times of disaster and humanitarian crises, as well as mitigating their effects or supporting investments, improving resilience. For today's meeting, we have a full agenda hearing from USAID, the UN World Food Program, Unicef, and Save the Children. We also have several other experts available across these organizations to provide greater detail on the severity of the crisis and potentially what actions may need to be taken. Each speaker will provide their assessment of the situation and opportunities for action through their programming or partnership. After the discussion, we will open it up for questions. So please submit your questions through the call by entering them into the chat box, and then we'll share them with the presenters. This call is possible through the private sector support of the Chamber Foundation's Disaster Response and Community Resilience Program, and certainly the organizations that are gathered here. In that context, we have 4 experts joining us today to discuss food security and the crisis in the Horn of Africa. We will hear from Sarah Charles, and the assistant to the administrator of USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance first, followed by Rania Dagash from UNICEF, Rukia Yaqub from the World Food Program, and Thomas Lay from Save the Children. Sarah Charles from USAID will share with us how the US government has responded to this humanitarian crisis and how the private sector can support. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for hosting us today. Thank you for all of the good work that the Chamber does today and every day to help respond to crises around the world. I'm really pleased to be here with colleagues from WFP, UNICEF, and Save the Children, as well as a number of other colleagues from USAID who are on hand to help answer any questions that you all might have. Rob, I'd also like to thank you for mentioning that earthquake in Afghanistan overnight, where we're already seeing reports of upwards of 1,000 fatalities. This earthquake, quite severe earthquake, happened in rural areas where structures really are not built to withstand this kind of earthquake. But you can rest assured that USAID partners are already responding to that earthquake. I'll talk a little bit later in my remarks about CIDI, a website that we have, which is a good landing spot for partner organizations that are responding in any number of countries, including an Afghanistan specific page. If anyone is interested in getting more information about partners that are on the ground in Afghanistan and already responding to that earthquake. Given Rob has already flagged the global food insecurity dynamic that many of you, I'm sure, are following and seeing, frankly, in prices even here in the United States, I'll hone in on what we're seeing in the Horn of Africa and what we think we would love to partner with all of you on. In the midst of the global food security crisis that Rob outlined, the Horn of Africa is facing the most severe food security crisis in the world right now. Over 16 million people currently face the threat of starvation as a result of historic drought in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. This number is expected to rise to 20 million people by September. The difference between that 16 million and 20 million is action right now, getting resources into the hands of partners that are on the ground and poised to respond. This is not just another drought in the Horn of Africa. This is the perfect storm of factors resulting in catastrophic levels of humanitarian need and long-term protracted impacts. The region is in the midst of the 4th consecutive drought season, and a 5th is forecast for later this year. The unprecedented drought is occurring against the backdrop of other recent and ongoing shocks, including conflict, COVID-19 and its related macro impacts, locusts, as well as challenges recovering from successive droughts that have decimated household resilience across the region. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is having significant impacts on the cost of food, fertilizer, and fuel, exacerbating humanitarian needs and further limiting the reach of humanitarian assistance across the region. In Ethiopia, the UN reports that the cost of food assistance has already increased nearly 70%. In Somalia, which relies heavily on Russia and Ukraine for wheat imports, wheat and vegetable oil prices have risen by 300% in some areas. An urgent scale-up of funding is needed to support humanitarian efforts and respond to the risk of famine and help prevent large-scale deaths. As humanitarians, we don't use these words, famine and starvation, lightly. We are talking right now about action to prevent significant loss of life. The United States estimates that over 1.8 billion is urgently needed right now to support critical life-saving assistance activities and prevent significant loss of life. In response to the drought, the United States has provided more than $507 million in humanitarian assistance to support emergency food, nutrition, health, water, sanitation, hygiene assistance that is saving lives right now. We're working with our UN and NGO implementing partners to respond quickly and effectively to save lives and assure that assistance meets those that are most in need. We're planning to do more and are quickly working with partners to scale up assistance, but we can't solve this crisis alone. We're urgently calling on all donors, including those of you in the private sector, to provide funding for immediate humanitarian assistance to help alleviate the suffering of millions of people across the Horn of Africa. Multinational and local private sector entities can and do play a critical role in responding to crises. USAID wants to thank the many private sector organizations that have so far generously contributed to Ukraine and many other crises around the world. I understand that the private sector has provided over 1.5 billion in cash and in-kind donations to the Ukraine crisis response alone. This level of support is unprecedented, and I hope we can build on that success in providing support in Ukraine and replicate it in the Horn of Africa. Employees from private sector organizations have generously contributed as well through personal donations and matching campaigns. And funding for the response in the Horn is what is desperately needed now and over the coming months. Providing monetary contributions directly to humanitarian organizations already working on the ground is what is recommended and is the most effective way to support turnkey relief operations and save lives right now. Some ways that you can help: incentivize employee cash contributions to humanitarian organizations by providing matching funds, make a cash contribution directly to humanitarian organizations, and work within industry groups to encourage other firms in your field to make cash contributions. With large-scale crises, the key is cash is best in most cases. It's fast, it's flexible, it's easy to share and use, making it the most helpful and least burdensome way to support frontline humanitarian responders without distracting from their primary task, which is helping people in need. Unlike material donations, cash involves no transportation costs, no shipping delays, or custom fees. It enables responsible relief organizations to spend more time providing aid instead of sorting and managing goods. Further, it supports the economy in affected countries by stimulating local markets, revitalizing employment, and generating cash flow, which is critical in the Horn right now. To support this cash is best message, USAID established the Center for International Disaster Assistance Information, or CIDI, with the goal of informing the public on how to give when disaster strikes abroad. On the CIDI website, you can find the names of organizations working on the ground in various responses, so in the Horn of Africa now or in Afghanistan, as I just mentioned. In addition, the website provides educational resources on donation management and best practice. Some international private businesses or entities may have unique skills, assets, or resources that they can bring to a humanitarian response, maybe special technology or logistics capacity, or maybe it's a unique business process, product, or service. In these cases, private actors should coordinate with international response actors to ensure contributions are appropriate and feasible. The organizations on this call can assist with these requests. Private sector entities, all of you are also welcome to reach out to our private sector engagement team and our Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Sarah. And I know that UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, has a video to share as well. So Will, could you please go ahead and share that before we go to Rania, please?
I am currently in Sida Dolo Health Center, an integrated health center that treats about 8,000 under 5 children and about 5,000 pregnant and lactating mothers. I sit here with Ismail and her 2 boys, Salman and Liban. They're 1 year old and she is pregnant. They've arrived from about 120 kilometers away. The children have diarrhea, they're vomiting, very weak, very dizzy. And she's receiving support and treatment in the center. She's one of the few lucky ones who actually made it. Many more are left behind and unable to reach centers like this. The drought is the reason that they have moved from 120 kilometers away. They've walked all the way here to receive services at this center. And she's one of the lucky ones who made it. Others are unable to and don't have these services. Our appeal to donors is to give us the resources to scale up and be closer to where people are affected by the drought, so they don't have to trek for 120 kilometers. She comes here to save not just the 2 twins, the 2 boys, but also the baby she carries in herself. And I don't know what else to say.
Rania, thanks for sharing that moving video. Do you have additional context to add to that?
Thanks, Rob, and thank you for having us today. Good morning and good evening to everyone. This video was actually taken a few weeks ago when Ruqayya and I had traveled to Somalia. And it was an exceptionally difficult mission, I must say, after a couple of decades for both of us in this line of work. It was hard, maybe because I've just returned to the region after a long time away, and I find the same issues in drought I left in 2007, the famine in 2010. I don't know if it was the weariness of the families that walked for days or just the state of children who made it, knowing many did not. But it was hard, is what I can say. Now, if you allow me, I'd like to paint a bit more of the picture that Sarah has set so well. Of the numbers that we just stated, at least 10 million children face this drought. And not only is it one of the worst climate-induced emergencies that we've seen in the last 40 years, but for many of those children, this isn't climate crisis in the future, it's what they're feeling the effects of that right now. Now, droughts are fundamentally a water crisis, and not enough of it for families that are agro-pastoralists or pastoralists means they can't water their crops, they can't feed their livestock, and they can't access water themselves. So it's compounded in many ways because it's a severe food insecurity crisis, and Ruqayya will speak to that, and it's a health crisis. It means that hundreds of thousands are on the move, and they do so to survive. It's one of the first coping mechanisms when a crisis like this hits. What's interesting also about this drought is we actually have really strong early warning systems in East Africa, and they worked because in February we sounded the alarm bells and we put out an appeal. And since then, it's been a 40% increase of families that are in need of assistance. Now, 1.8 million children need urgent treatment. They're on the brink of starvation, and the number is most likely to rise. They don't have the clean water. The bodies are weak of the children from the malnutrition, and they're falling sick with cholera and measles. And they're facing other life-threatening diseases, as you could see. And then there was the war in Ukraine and its impact on the ground. As it has affected communities the world over, including the US with food and fuel price increases, for people in the Horn and the children, the impact is dramatic because pushing them further into deep poverty with all savings and safety nets absolutely eroded. So the rising prices, just to qualify that for us, meant that the therapeutic treatment we give to those children, like the twins we just saw, are becoming more and more expensive. And just with last week's calculation, I think it's an additional 12 million just on that commodity hike in price for us to get the RUTF that we treat children with when they're severely malnourished. Now, the good news is we have been able to react and to react quickly. We've reached about 350,000 children with this therapeutic treatment over the past few months. And this was only possible with the strong support of our key partners, such as the US. And Sarah, I can't thank you and your team enough. We really appreciate your recent announcement also of an additional 105 million for food and humanitarian assistance in the region. So thank you. I have two more messages. Now, as I said, this is originally a water crisis for families, and it's compounded with nutrition and health, and children are the particular victims of it. In terms of water, what we see is of the populations affected, there are 4.2 million children facing dire water shortages. There's just simply not enough to drink or to wash or to cook. And while UNICEF is the lead agency on water, sanitation, and hygiene, we also work with governments and the private sector partners to provide access to household and drinking water. Again, thanks to our donors, we've managed to reach about 1 million people so far, 905,000, with clean water for drinking, cooking, personal hygiene. It's encouraging, but we still have a huge gap in our response, and we depend on your and everyone's generosity to help us scale that up before it's too late. My final point is that while this is a humanitarian emergency and it is about life-saving needs today, so that we don't get to where we were in 2010 with the famine. In 2010, we lost 250,000 people, the bulk of which were children. And we don't want to go there. And so we do want to work closely with everyone to avert that. Resilience is a big part of the response, not just the life-saving. And I've often said, you need to be able to respond to both, because what resilience does, it means we don't only truck water, which saves lives now, but we work on climate resilient solutions. We tap into groundwater sources. We work with international engineers and experts to bring new, lasting, inexpensive, and sometimes expensive for that matter, technologies where they're most needed. And it provides access to water. It helps the schools function. It helps improve nutrition and health. In South Ethiopia, I think we dug into about 600 meters for one of our boreholes. And that community today is buffered from this drought by the presence of that borehole. We also work closely with the local private sector to innovate and bring about local solutions. Our partnership with BHA really has helped us pursue solutions that ensure the diets of vulnerable children, pregnant and lactating mothers, adolescent girls are enriched with animal protein. And this is a sustainable market approach to large-scale production of egg powder, and it builds on local business return of investment through public-private partnerships. We simply need to do both to save children right now and invest in the development of our communities who desire and deserve a better future for their children. Now, we are appealing for your support, and to respond to our Unicef appeal of about 250 million on life-saving and about 600 million for resilience, reach out to Sarah Berger in our US office. And her contact can be found. If Lawrence or someone can help me put her contact up, I would be most grateful. And just reinforcing Sarah's point, cash is best at this point, and it's a lot more flexible for us to use quickly and directly. Thank you once again.
Thank you for that. The World Food Program is one of the first agencies on the ground in global emergencies caused by conflict, climate shocks, pandemics, including the crisis in the Horn of Africa. So, Ruqayyah, I'll turn it over to you, and look to you to further add to the previous briefers.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for hosting us and for the invitation. I think Rob, Sarah, and Rania have given a good background on the Horn of Africa drought. I just want to give a framework. This eastern region, about 32% of the globally food insecure people are hosted here in Eastern Africa. So we have already, before the drought, before the Ukraine crisis, we already have a significant number of food insecure in the region. The Horn of Africa, Sarah has given the figures. We are expecting the numbers to go up to 20 million. So the numbers, the needs are increasing, and we're all struggling to see how we can respond. So I think Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya are the top countries affected by the drought right now. Djibouti also has been affected, but also Eritrea and also the Karamoja area of region of Uganda. So these are, the more we get information, the drought is affecting more countries. So that's just a bit of a background on this. So WFP has appealed for $982 million to respond to the drought and to reach 7.8 million people across the 4 countries, excluding Eritrea and Uganda. So far we have received $205 million for Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And we have 777 million still to be raised. Let me take that opportunity to thank Sarah, her team, but also the US government and the people for being generous. So far, we have received quite a significant amount, but the gap is still quite huge as well. So these people affected by the drought in the Horn of Africa are mainly pastoralists, but also they have agriculture, small subsistence agriculture. Their livestock have been affected by the drought. It's not just agriculture. So we have, for example, an estimate over 7 million livestock have died as of June 2022. So we're looking at populations that have already started to move from their place of origin because of these 4 consecutive failures of rains. The 5th rain season, which is due October to December, is also forecasted to be a failure. So it doesn't really look good. We are unable to scale up our response right now, but we are trying our best to reach, to at least prevent famine while responding to the needs. At the moment, WFP is providing support through cash support to families so they can immediately have life-saving needs met. But the needs are bigger than what we can afford to provide. So this is also, the Ukraine crisis is also impacting on our operations. Before the Ukraine crisis in 2021, inflation was already rising across the region due to the impact of COVID. And currently, these 4 countries that we have mentioned, they have, 2-digit food inflations. So this is an existing problem. Global fertilizer prices have also risen by nearly 30% since the start of 2022. Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan have the highest risk of fertilizer shortages and price hikes in Eastern Africa. So we expect production next year is even going to be lower than 2022. At the moment, prices are high, food prices are very high, but next year, if the war in Ukraine continues, we are going to see unavailability of food also. So not just prices of food. Our operations to deliver life-saving interventions have gone up quite significantly because of all those increase in prices. I think I have only 5 minutes. So if I see that what can the private sector do to support? I think one of the areas is obviously to provide direct support to save lives and to also prevent excess mortality from happening. The other areas that the private sector can help is also with fertilizers, for example, because at least countries that are able to produce next year would be able to have access to fertilizers. So input to agricultural products is really also key. Supporting the livelihood of these people and their livestock and agriculture is important. But also generally, I think improving the food systems is really important. In Africa, we know more than 80% of what is produced by smallholder farmers. So they also suffer from post-harvest losses and other inefficiencies. So I think these are the areas that I would just like to flag where the private sector can come in also. So thank you very much. I see you face, Rob, so I think I have completed my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know we're going to have some additional dialogue in the Q&A here in a second. But before we get to that, Thomas Lays with the Save the Children, and they certainly work in some of the hardest reached places where it's toughest to be a child. So I'll turn it over to Thomas before we get to the Q&A.
Thank you, Rob. Can I just get a confirmation you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great, cool. So yeah, good afternoon to everyone, or good evening to fellow panelists over in East Africa here, and thank you to USAID and the Chamber of Commerce for convening this space. It's an exciting opportunity to engage with a set of actors that we don't typically end up engaging with. And so I just wanted to, you'll have to forgive me. You'll likely hear a lot of repetition because we all speak the same language and we all experience the same situation here, right? But from my point of view, there are crises and there are crises, right? And if you take one thing from today, I want you to take away the message that you have been directly asked to help alleviate a famine and prevent it ever happening again. And I can testify to that, as our other panelists have as well. We've proven it's efficient. We've proven we can do it in 2017. The second part of that, preventing it ever happening again, is clearly a job yet to be done. And that's why we are here today to talk about the situation we're in and how we can act collectively to try and prevent this happening. Now, if East Africa only crops up on your radar when you're helping your kid with their geography homework or when you're having strategy meetings on emerging markets, you can be forgiven for thinking that this is a cyclical crisis and that African children are always hungry. And I get that. I grew up in the UK, and through osmosis of seeing the imagery on news reports, I understand that. So when the news chatter, social media trending things start to tell you that things will get bad in the Horn at the moment, I can understand why there might be questions going around your minds around, well, wait, what again? Didn't that happen before? And as others have said, and I think we're probably alluding to one of the best kept secrets that shouldn't be a secret, is we've done enough, right, to prevent things happening. However, that's only if the circumstances that led to the famines in the past were to repeat themselves. If they were to do that now, they wouldn't result in a famine because of the resilience and lifestyle pivots that have been achieved through the successes of multilateral aid and foreign development assistance through the likes of USAID. Congressional bipartisan support has been a massive part of that through Unicef, WFP, Save the Children, and we function across a development and a humanitarian spectrum, and we have delivered on that promise to save lives and strengthen the resilience. However, communities in East Africa, much like farmers in the Midwest, are dependent on regular windows of rainfall each year and a reliable distribution of that rainfall within that window. Now, if those seasonal windows move or the distribution is disrupted, then that crop is either a failure or the fields need substantial maintenance, tender loving care to ensure a successful harvest. Even then, it may not bring sufficient reward to provide sustenance for the family because of the costs involved in nurturing that crop to harvest. In 2011, it was 2 failed rainy seasons and an almost complete lack of access to basic services to trigger a famine, and 250,000 people died. Fast forward a decade, and today we're witnessing the cumulative impact of successive shocks over the last 3-4 years. And you've heard them already, but I'll repeat them. 4 failed rainy seasons and the prospect of a 5th in the next few months, as opposed to just 2 a decade ago. In addition, there's been a desert locust pest infestation that's consumed anywhere from 30 to 70% of the meager crop that came from those poor seasons. A global pandemic that's disrupted the trade, inflated prices, and the war in Ukraine that has compounded the world's economic problems. And importantly, distracted the world's attention for a critical 2-month period when we should have been mobilizing behind the Horn of Africa, as we did in 2017. Now, if resilience hadn't been improved over the last decade, thanks largely to the consistent leadership of America and the mandate entrusted to USAID, the security situation hadn't improved in Somalia, then we would have seen a famine 2 years ago at least, right? What we're seeing now is a system that can weather the shocks that history has told us come. But just like any system in the world, there is a breaking point. And whilst the last decade of multilateral aid successes have achieved what we set out to achieve, the shocks of today are far beyond anything that programming and the governance improvements were designed to deal with. Put it another way, Australia is probably the best equipped country in the world to fight forest fires, and yet in 2019 they needed international support to contain their fires. with all due respect, FEMA's expertise has a point at which events overwhelm the capacity. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the Horn of Africa now. It's no different. A resilient system has reached a breaking point. So let's get specific, and you've heard numbers already, right? We're talking about 18 million people, 16 million people, nearly 20 million people at the end of the year facing an emergency state of hunger across Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia. In Somalia, starvation is escalating faster than previously feared, right? And estimates now show the number of people in catastrophic famine-like conditions is set to increase fivefold from 38,000 in May to over 200,000 in September. And unless the world wakes up to the scale of this unfolding crisis, 386,000 children could face severe malnutrition, which is life-threatening if it doesn't get treated. Now, July was originally feared to be the peak of this crisis, thanks to superb agility, I think, by Unicef, WFP, Save the Children, and our other partners. We've accelerated funding, we've reprogrammed funding, and so we've pushed the peak of this crisis from maybe expected to be July to being maybe September. And to quantify that, Save the Children has gone from 80,000 people a month to reaching 200,000 people a month, right? But we'll run out of money at the point when this hits its peak if we don't find more. So as I open with, multilateral aid works. We've proven it can be effective, right? Cash driven was the characterization of the 2017 response. And those systems have evolved and have improved. Cash is best, you've already heard, right? We had to go through a scale up in 2017, but those infrastructures exist today, right? And in fact, they're even more robust today than they were before. They just need the funding. They've got the bandwidth, they've got the absorption capacity. Save the Children, as an example, we can accommodate an extra 80 million with just the teams we've currently got on the ground already. The wider system needs 4.4 billion in the Horn of Africa to be able to respond. If we get this money, we will save lives. And that is the unashamedly honest ask that we have right now, is we need your philanthropic cash, right? Last week, I was in southern Ethiopia, and to maybe humanize this a little bit and build on what Rania said at the start with her testimony from a stabilization center, I also witnessed stabilization centers, and those are essentially the hospital wards that children get taken to when they are at the point of death, and if they don't get treatment, then they will die. And I witnessed that, and exactly as Rania said, it's hard, very hard, and they are the fortunate ones. And I feel very, very privileged to work for Save the Children and have the opportunity to be able to facilitate that type of service for children. But as well as seeing that, I also witnessed and spoke to communities in a little settlement that people had been displaced into. And I've been talking to communities in the Horn of Africa for the last sort of 5 or 6 years. And I haven't ever heard anybody recognize the death of their livelihood until last week. And there was an elderly pastoral guy who very articulately explained that his livelihood is over. His way of life is gone, and he doesn't have any idea what the future will hold. And then there was a 13-year-old boy called Mohammed who stepped up in front of a big group of his elders, and he very powerfully told me all he wanted to do was play football and go to school. But he didn't have a school to go to, and he didn't have a football to play with. What he did have was the burden of the pressure that his generation is feeling to find the solutions for this livelihood crisis. And if we've got a scenario facing us today where we could lose hundreds of thousands of people because of famine in the next few weeks and months, and we've got an underfunded response to that, and we've got a 5th season that's likely to fail at the end of the year, so we're no longer talking about a 2 or 3 month crisis, we're talking about 12 to 18 month long crisis. We cannot simply look at this in a short-term lens. we have to be doing things in parallel. We've got to be looking at the immediate, fund those feeding states, fund the water trucking, fund the stabilization centers, but also look at the livelihood piece. And that's where I think the sort of the second ask here, which is a vaguer ask, but it's an incredibly important one. It's not only your cash, that's the first ask we need, but we also need you to stick with us, right? And you've all demonstrated a commitment by attending this call today. We can learn a lot from you, right? And the system that we function with, multilateral aid, needs at least an additional $20 billion a year to meet the basic requirements that we've got, right? And that gap might be even higher this year because the needs have escalated this year. Now, we're not going to be able to just meet that gap through the traditional funding mechanisms, right? The donor community, and USAID is the leading example of this, and by far the largest contributor, is just not designed to be able to meet that financial gap. And we're not going to be able to meet it just by passing the hat around and asking people to put money in it. So we need a systemic approach to this, and we've got to recognize an ecosystem that is broader than just ourselves, and you guys feature heavily in that. And there's a lot that you've got that we can learn from. There's a lot of support that you provide bilaterally that we can complement. We could be a vehicle for you to uphold and outlive your philanthropic commitments. But my longer term ask here, as well as immediate cash, is stick with us, stick with the philanthropic piece, stick with a sense of global humanity. And together, collectively, listening to communities, listening to local actors, listening to governments in the countries where this is affected, collectively we'll be able to do something about it. So what we're asking you to do is do what you do best, right? Invest to ensure success. And in doing that, you will prevent a famine. You will save lives, not now, but also in the future. Thanks. Rob, back to you.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks all of you for examining the unique aspects of the situation from your perspectives. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and I think Sarah might want to answer one just really about Ukraine and the competition for scarce resources. And Sarah, I don't know if you would like to respond to that, but just really how to compete with the challenge of responding to the Ukraine, but also responding to the Horn of Africa concern.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the question. I'll speak first about the impact Ukraine is having on resource mobilization in the United States, and then what we're seeing in the rest of the world, because I think the US has actually been quite exceptional, and our Congress recognized first in March and again in May that the war in Ukraine, that Russia's war in Ukraine was going to have an impact on global food security. And so when they passed supplemental funding first in March and then again in May to respond to humanitarian needs in Ukraine, they also provided the flexibility to respond to needs around the world that were being exacerbated because of the war in Ukraine. So in the United States, the war in Ukraine has had a bit of a coattail in public sector, so funding programmed by the United States, by USAID, to support humanitarian operations over the world, with the Horn being the top of our list to focus, given the impact of spiking commodity prices are having on what was already a dire food security situation. I spend a lot of my time talking to fellow donors, people who lead organizations or humanitarian arms of organizations similar to USAID in Europe and elsewhere. And in other countries, we're seeing the opposite impact. So Ukraine humanitarian budgets are coming at the expense of global humanitarian budgets, that there is a tremendous amount of focus and attention and goodwill coming, understandably, as people watch the horror in Ukraine, but that means a lot of resources have flowed into Ukraine, and the pot available for the rest of the world is less. And the parliaments in Europe have not responded in the way that Congress here has responded in ensuring that those Ukraine resources are additive and in fact identifying additional resources for the rest of the world. So we're already seeing the impact. We've been doing quite a few comparisons of how the response to drought in 2017 in the Horn was different than how the response is now. And in many ways, we've learned a lot in those intervening years. Our partners are much better equipped to respond. They know the interventions, they're pre-positioned, but the resources is the biggest difference between 2017 and this year. So in 2017, the world came together and mobilized about $2.6 billion in assistance in order to avert famine. In 2017. We haven't seen that level of response from the rest of the world. And in fact, some of the biggest donors just haven't shown up in the way that they historically would. And we do see a pretty direct link between the war, the funding going towards Ukraine and the rest of the world.
Thanks, Sarah. We also have a couple of different questions, and I'll pose it to you, Sarah, and to the rest of the group. And that is thinking about really the second and third order effects. So certainly there has already been mentioned in the briefings, migration patterns, and then also a concern for those children and others that are vulnerable. What are some of the other tangible effects that we need to be mindful of? It's not just the water situation, but some of those other aspects as well.
So I'll speak very briefly to that, but then turn it over to a number of my partners on the phone, on the screen, who have more recently been in the region and can speak to specific impacts. But one of the early, as one of the panelists mentioned, we had early indications that there would be severe impacts from the drought in the Horn. The earliest indicators were really around rainfall and the impact that would have, but actually displacement patterns were also kind of a canary in the coal mine, seeing Somalis in particular cross into northern Kenya, where we've seen people making a very perilous journey and arriving in quite dire straits to a region that is already under extreme stress. So we are seeing displacement. We're also seeing, as Thomas mentioned, we're seeing livelihood impacts. 2.2 million livestock have died in Ethiopia, southern Ethiopia alone as a result of this drought, and that will have long-term impacts in terms of people's ability to recover, even should we see improved rains in the next cycles. They've expended assets to pay for food, and then they've also had livestock death, and their livestock are even more vulnerable to disease, pestilence, and of course malnutrition as well, which again will have long-term impacts on prospects for recovery. But I suspect Rania or Thomas or Rukia may have more to add.
Rob, if you allow me, I think I can build on what Sarah just said on other effects on children that we are seeing. So, and I'm really grateful to whoever asked this question, because we don't highlight this enough. So the drought emergency is also quickly turning into an education crisis. We have about over 1 million children at the risk of dropping out of school. There's no waters in the school they're at. For those displaced, there aren't enough schools in the new locations of displacement. And Ruqayya and I saw that firsthand in Dolo. Thousands of schools lack water. And already before any of that, the number of children who are out of school was disturbingly high, about 15 million actually. And we also saw hope and the reverse, where we at WFP worked together in response to a school in an old displacement camp, where WFP went in with school feeding. We could retain the children in the school. And that was an incredible buffer for the families. And in one of the schools we went to, the headmistress said about 20 to 30 children show up every day wanting to access the school, and we can't do it because they can't absorb them. and there isn't enough to feed them or to take them in. The second element of child protection we're seeing that is significant is child marriage. That's another coping mechanism that you see people do in crises like this. We've seen a 50% increase in some of the drought affected regions compared to 2021, and the rates of female genital mutilation, a precursor for child marriage in parts of this region, also on the rise because families adopt negative coping mechanisms for survival. They sell their daughters. So it really is multifaceted, and these sectors don't get any support. Actually, we're really, really low between water, sanitation, nutrition, and health. They're our biggest ask, and we get a lot, but we don't around this, around education actually and child protection. Over from my side.
Any other perspectives to share related to that, Thomas?
Just want to, yeah, just echo Rania's comments on the education piece. And I think my testimony from Mohammed in southern Ethiopia spoke to that point. It's also, just to elaborate maybe on the protection pieces, you see increased domestic abuse at times like this. When household stresses increase, people get more tense and they take it out on people that are close to them. The other element I just wanted to mention, linked to the displacement and the movement of populations, is it's not necessarily the biggest movement of population we're seeing is not cross-country borders, it's internal within the countries. And Somalia in particular is seeing huge displacements. There's already 3 million displaced at the beginning of this year, the beginning of this particular spike in hunger. And they're expecting at least another 800,000 to be displaced on top of that. Now, that 3 million, about 1.5 million of that 3 million had already just been displaced from the 2017 crisis, right? So one of the sort of more almost existential knock-on consequences here is linked to urbanization. And are we seeing an acceleration in urbanization trends as opposed to temporary displacement, especially if the consequences on livelihoods are as severe as people are talking about? And the fact that we're in a 4th successive season that's historically never happened before, and a 5th coming up again, we're now starting to get into the realms of desertification, where you start to see the likelihood of pasture regrowth never happening again. These are the kind of longer term and the knock-on consequences that we'll see. It is such a multifaceted piece, which again is why I think moving forward, as well as the immediate funding, the immediate food and water assistance that we need to provide, we do need to start thinking systemically about a broader ecosystem of actors and how we all complement each other's efforts. Over.
Unfortunately, go ahead, Rukia.
No, I think we see climate change is not a hypothesis or idea anymore. We see it in action, I think. So this is a real, I think for me, this was when I went to Rania to Somalia, you could feel that this is not just something that we talk about, but it's really happening and impacting on people. And you see the impact on the elderly people, on the children, and everybody. And you can see that people, after walking for 3, 4, 5 days to a place where they can get assistance for food and water, some of them are just dying because, you know, the body is too exhausted. And I think families also don't move immediately the moment the rains stop coming. They try their best to stay where they are. The assistance is not reaching them to where they live. So they have to move. By the time they reach a place, unfortunately, we see a lot of life lost. So that was a painful thing, that intangible thing. So climate change is real, and I think it's really, we have to take it more seriously perhaps than we did. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank all of you for sharing your perspectives and the plea for assistance. And so I'll just reiterate, give money to the nonprofits as soon as you can to solve these challenges. And they're both long-term and near-term challenges. I think we heard that today. In case for those of you that did not get your question answered, I'm looking through and I think we answered all the questions. We will have a recording available of this call today, as well as some of the resources that were mentioned specifically in this call, as well as some additional resources that we've had available. So again, thank you to the experts for sharing your perspective. I know that this is a challenge that is going to be playing out for some time. And certainly, as we heard at the start of the call, and also what Sarah addressed, given the earthquake in Afghanistan, there are so many different opportunities to do good. We just are trying to make sure that everyone's aware of what the situation is so they can make their own decision on how best to do that. Thanks for joining today and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And Sarah, we're waiting for you this side.
Way soon. Thank you, Rob, and thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Tom. Bye, Rogeya.
Ciao.